It's been a difficult year for many people, and for that reason I pray that as we come to the book of Job in the Bible and look at its message for us today, that each one of us will find some real help there, and that this will be relevant and it will be appropriate at this particular time in the experience of many of us. Job is probably the oldest book in the Bible, and it deals with one of the oldest problems, the problem of suffering. The books of the Bible are not arranged in chronological order, as we might at first expect, but they're grouped according to the type of literature that they are. Job belongs to that section of the Old Testament known as wisdom poetry, along with such books as the Psalms and the Proverbs. The poet Tennyson describes the book of Job as the greatest poem of ancient and modern times. But although it is wisdom poetry, it tells the story of a real man who actually lived. And there's so much to learn through the real experiences, the difficult experiences, the painful experiences that he went through, even though it was so long ago. Job lived after the days of the great worldwide flood and after the building of the Tower of Babel, when the human race became divided into separate nations. We know that. Why? Well, because it mentions people of different nations, the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans in chapter 1. But there's no mention in the book of Job of the temple at Jerusalem, or of the tabernacle earlier than that, or even of the nation of Israel. Worship, as we see in chapter 1, took place within families, not in a central place. So Job must have lived before Israel was established as a people. And that puts him around or soon after the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the patriarchs or forefathers of Israel. Job's age when he died was similar to theirs, 140 years. That information is given at the end of the book. And that fits really with the average lifespan of people at that early stage of history as the Bible records it. Job wasn't a direct descendant of Abraham, but we're told that he lived in the land of Uz, east of the River Jordan. One of Noah's great-grandsons was called Uz, according to Genesis 10. And Abraham's brother Nahor also had a son called Huz or Uz, Genesis 22 records. So Job may have been from one of those more distant family lines. So that's something of the background and the context to this real life story of human suffering. And this theme is still a live issue today, because although culture and technology have changed in some ways, the kinds of problems we face in our lives today and in our world today are the kinds of problems that human beings have had in every generation. So we're thinking today, in the first place, about the problem of suffering. Things were going really well in Job's life at the beginning of the story. He was well off financially. His farming business was successful. He had 7,000 sheep, we're told, and 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys. He was blessed with a large family. 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had a good reputation as a man of faith in God, and he was well known for his upright life, verse 1 tells us. He was respected, he was well known in his community, a leader in his community, someone that people looked up to. He's described in verse 3 as the greatest of all the people of the East. So he's a man of some standing in society, and he's very happy at that point. And then suddenly, his whole life falls apart. We were once moving house and I was carrying a large cardboard box and there was far too much stuff in it. And halfway up the path, the bottom fell out, spilling the contents everywhere. It can be like that sometimes in life. Or to change the analogy, you're paddling on the shoreline and the waves are getting stronger and they come thick and fast. And before you know it, one goes right over your head. And just as you're getting on your feet again, another knocks you over and then another. It was like that for Job. Troubles came his way like those waves of the sea. One piece of bad news after another knocked him back and he couldn't get up. First, enemies came and killed his servants and stole away some of his livestock. Then came another horrific event, a terrible lightning storm or something like it. Not so much a natural event as a supernatural one, because it tells us in verse 16, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And then came the greatest blow of all. Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking in a house, and a cyclone swept across the land, tore through the house, and tragically every one of those young people was buried in the rubble and died. How could he possibly deal with something like that? Some well-meaning person might say, well, that's so bad. It must be really awful. But at least you've got your health, Job. As long as you've got your health, you'll be okay. But what if you haven't? And in Job's case, that was the next thing to go. Painful boils broke out all over his body, from the soles of his feet to his head. And by chapter 2, verse 8, the man who once sat as an elder in the gate of the city is now sat on a rubbish dump outside the city, scraping his festering scabs with a broken piece of pottery. A picture of abject misery and forsakenness. He's all alone in his suffering. The problem of suffering. It is a problem. It's a problem to all of us to take in and to cope with and to understand. In John Blanchard's booklet, Where is God When Things Go Wrong?, he quotes the British novelist H.G. Wells. When he saw the horrors of the Second World War, he wrote this: "If I felt that there was an omnipotent God who looked down on battles and deaths and all the waste and horror of this war, able to prevent these things, doing them to amuse himself, I would spit in his empty face." Suffering is a problem. It is a real problem to all of us. And here is the problem. How do you reconcile the belief that there is a God who is loving and powerful and in sovereign control of all things with the fact that there is terrible suffering in the world? But the problem of suffering is more particular than that. Not just why is there suffering, but why do good people suffer? If it were only the Hitlers of this world, or the Osama bin Ladens, or the mass murderers, or the drug barons, or people traffickers, or sex offenders, then you might understand perhaps. But it's not. Good people, godly people suffer. Job, a righteous man, suffered. As a young man, soon after I became a Christian, I was deeply impressed by the life of one of the kindest people I'd ever met. An elderly lady in our church. She never made a fuss. She was gentle and thoughtful and generous. But she was very ill, with severe arthritis. Her hands were disfigured. It was painful for her even to shake hands. She was confined to a wheelchair and in terrible, constant pain. Yet there was an inner joy that radiated from her personality that was so obvious to all who knew her. She didn't talk about her own problems, but would always ask how I was, how someone else was. She was genuinely interested in other people. Her health declined, and sadly she died. But she died full of faith and full of confident hope in her Saviour, the Lord Jesus Christ. Since then, I've met many good people, godly people, who have experienced great suffering and have been the most amazing examples of patient trust and calm assurance in God. Does it surprise us? Does it shock us that godly people suffer? We're told right away in chapter 1 of the book of Job that that is the case. It's part of the reality of living in a fallen world. And being good or godly does not make you immune from tragedy or trouble or illness or loss. Job was a righteous man. Verse 1 says, that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And that is precisely the problem for Job's 3 friends, whom we meet in chapter 3. That's what they struggled to understand. And that's what Job himself later struggled to understand. And if we're honest, that's what we struggle to understand too. Job was a righteous person who suffered terribly. Job's 3 friends couldn't get their heads around that. They didn't have a category for that. In their minds, good, righteous people are blessed by God. Bad or evil people are punished with suffering. That's how they viewed the world. That, in a simplistic way, was their expectation. The problem is, life very often isn't like that. Good, righteous people suffer. Evil people sometimes get off lightly. We're living in a broken and a twisted world. A world of many tangled threads that never seem to get unravelled. Why? Because human beings have turned their backs on the God who made them. And so the original perfect creation has been damaged and spoilt by sin. And the consequences are all too plain around us. And suffering and death are part of that reality in a fallen world like this. Accepting that fact is the key to understanding this book. Coming to terms with the reality of suffering as a normal part of life. A normal part of the life of good people, righteous people. Every person in this present world. And yet, to still be able to trust God, that's what this book of Job is all about. Job comes to see, not straight away, but he comes to see that you have to look beyond this life for vindication and justice and a better future. It won't always be like this. A believer can look forward with great hope to the day of Christ's return, when this twisted world will be straightened out again. All wrong will be put right, finally. That's the vision that is set out for us here. That's the focus of the book of Job. And the whole of the Bible, in fact. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17 says, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. If God is powerful and loving, how can it be that good people suffer? Some conclude that God isn't powerful, or that he isn't loving, or that he doesn't exist at all. But does that answer our questions? Does that give us real explanations for life and the future? It doesn't answer the problem. In fact, it leaves you in more confusion than ever. Comfort is not found by rejecting the truth about God, but by embracing it. God is still in control, and we see that very clearly in chapter 1. There is a divine purpose. And next time we're going to peek behind the curtain. Verses 6 to 11 give us a glimpse of what is normally hidden from our eyes: the realm of God and the heavenly angelic world. And we're going to be allowed to eavesdrop on the conversation between God and Satan that explains what was really going on in Job's life at that time. So we're going to go backstage next week, behind the scenes of this unfolding drama, and see it from a different angle. But all that we need to take hold of at this point is that there is a divine purpose. We might not be able to work out what that is with any precision. The Bible does give us some reasons why God allows suffering, but it doesn't give us a complete answer. But those reasons are not really spelt out to Job either. Job can't see behind the scenes, even as we are allowed to do. He's kept in the dark. And to a large extent, so even are we. We're not let into all the secrets of God's plan. We cannot know everything that he knows. He is God. The answer to the question, what has Job done to deserve this, is nothing. It's not related to what he has done or not done. It's not related to how good a life or otherwise he has lived. There's something bigger going on here. It's not just about what happened to Job as an individual person. There's a bigger battle going on here. It's about how faith, true faith in God, survives by the grace of God. It survives every attack of the evil one and comes through unscathed and victorious in the end. It's about the glory of God. It's to prove that whatever Satan falsely says, God in fact was right. His servant does not curse God to his face, but he keeps on trusting against all the odds. He keeps on trusting because God, the all-powerful and the sovereign one, is upholding him and loves him and will not let him go. We may not understand God's ways, but like Job, we can learn to trust him. We may not fully grasp God's purposes, but we can be sure that he knew what he was doing with Job and that he knows what he's doing with us. But let me just remind you of something else that you already know before we finish our message today. We've seen that Job, a righteous man, suffered. But you also know, don't you, about another exceptionally righteous man who once lived and who suffered. He was even more righteous than Job. He suffered even more than Job suffered. He didn't deserve it. If anyone deserved not to suffer, it was him. You know who I'm speaking of, don't you? Jesus Christ, God's Son. Jesus, a righteous man, suffered. He was without sin. He was holy and harmless and undefiled, separate from sinners, says Hebrews 7 verse 26. All the days of his life in this world, he did nothing but good. He healed the sick. He taught the truth of God. He showed love and mercy and even forgave his enemies. And yet, this sinless one became treated as if he was a sinner, the worst of sinners, and he was punished. He was accused unfairly and falsely of sin. Terrible wickedness. Yet he'd done nothing, and he was condemned to die. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 21 says, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." He died to bear away our sin and guilt. If he hadn't suffered, you couldn't be saved. It was necessary. It was planned. At the time, no one except him really understood the reason for that plan. He submitted to the Father's will. Not my will, your will be done. Through him there is hope, only through him, by believing in his name. Yes, there is hope even in a world that is falling apart. There is hope in Jesus Christ. You'll never be happy, you'll never have peace, you'll never have hope beyond this life until you come to him and trust in him. Will you believe in his name? Will you find that hope, that certainty for your eternal future? Don't struggle against God's providences in your life. Submit to him. Let him have control, for he does, in reality, already have control of all things. And then, whatever you go through, his grace is sufficient for you. And whatever you go through, you will be able to say with confidence, as the Apostle Paul did in Romans 8 verse 18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us."